Hey, welcome back. Let's jump into another section here, Task D of the Fundamentals of Instruction. This is on assessments and critiques. Why are these important, you might ask? Well, it's pretty obvious. If the student doesn't know how they're doing, how they're progressing, or how they're not progressing, they can't improve. So, a lot of information here. Let's get started. An assessment provides feedback to both the student and the teacher on how each other are doing. All right, so it's not just for the student's learning sake, it's for the instructor also to know if their delivery methods, if their teaching methods are being effective or not. Assessments give the instructor insight into the student's level of understanding, and an assessment must have the following components. Let's get the pen going here. First, it must be objective. All right. Subjective can be open to interpretation. Something objective is matter of fact. It has to be frank and honest, and talk about or meet the criteria that have been established for a given task. It has to be flexible. Okay, um, it's not rigid and set in stone. The conditions change, the environment changes. So an assessment of a student's landing ability on a perfectly calm day is going to be different than an assessment of their landing ability with a stiff crosswind. Okay, so it has to be flexible. The student has to accept your assessment. Um, in order to accept it, they have to have confidence in your abilities and in your expertise. If they don't have that trust in you, your assessment is no good to them. So they have to be willing to accept it. Next, comprehensive. Okay? Your assessment should cover everything that was taught that day or was practiced. All right, you can't just pick and choose pieces and parts to talk about and critique, and otherwise, the student's going to wonder, well, what about the rest? Did I do good on that, or was that bad also? Next is constructive. Just move this so we can see. Our list here. Has to be constructive, right? You just can't berate people. You have to tell them how to improve. There has to be a plan in there to progress. Otherwise, it's just nitpicking, and it does no good for anybody. Next, organized. Your assessment should be organized. Uh, However you want to do that, starting at the beginning and moving towards the end, starting with the strong points and moving to the weak points, vice versa. Should have a flow and organization to it, though. Your assessment needs to be thoughtful. I'm going to put that because that's important. If you just tell a student, hey, your landings are fine, and don't give any other feedback, they're going to wonder, is he really putting time and effort into this assessment? Am I really just doing fine, or am I just getting in the way? Am I taking up his time and a hindrance to him? So it has to be thoughtful. And finally, a good assessment needs to be specific. Don't just tell them, hey, your landings are fine. Tell them, look, let's break it down. Let's talk about your traffic patterns. All right, so on downwind, you're doing a really good job holding airspeed. On short final, you're doing a good job of being stabilized. So be specific with your assessments. What kind of assessments are there? Well, we have a traditional assessment, and we have, go down here, an authentic assessment. Traditional. What do you think a traditional assessment might be? Written test, quiz, something like that. Those are traditional assessments. It can be graded satisfactory or unsat. It can be on a point system. But the important point is that a traditional assessment is more instructor-centered and not necessarily what was learned by the student. It was more how well the material was taught. So a traditional, or you want to say written assessment, should have the following factors, and I'm going to run out of room here. It should be reliable. Okay, it produces the same results every time it's given because it's the same material or the same questions asked every time. It has to be valid. Okay, that's pretty obvious, but it's important. It needs to be legitimate to the concepts that were taught. It has to be usable. What this is referring to is more the mechanics or the logistics of the assessment. Is the font typeface readable? Is it too small? Does it match the paper color so you can't read it? It has to be usable in order to be effective. It has to be objective. We talked about that up above a little bit, but it does need to be objective. Oops, freak out mode there. It has to also be comprehensive. Comprehensive, so it covers everything that was discussed and not just one little facet. And finally, it has to be discriminatory. So by that, I mean that it has to have a range of values of scores. So it has to have some easy questions and some hard questions so that students can show how well they excel. If it had all easy questions and everybody got 100, then you would have no range of grading, and you'd have no way of knowing how well people actually understand the material. If you have some hard questions in there, it allows students to show off, if you will, their knowledge and their understanding, their ability to transfer that learning, what they learned, and demonstrate how well they understand it by answering the hard questions. Right? So these 6 concepts, what you need for a good traditional assessment. I'm going to come down here, talk about authentic assessments. These are not so much not written like the traditional, but a student performs a real-world task, right? It makes them demonstrate critical thinking skills, and it's really the heart of aviation training. The students will learn to assess their own skills and shortcomings, and there's a few techniques that we can do this, or we can use to do this, I should say. First, let's talk about the collaborative assessment. Whoops. Collaborative. What do I mean by that? Um, this is done by asking open-ended questions of the student. We might ask them to replay the lesson, have them describe what happened, right? So we just taught you, or I just taught you how to spin the aircraft, how to recover from a spin. Describe what happened to me, and then let them explain it in their own words what happened. Next, reconstruct. What would they do different next time? What could they do differently to get a different outcome? So after they have described what just happened, have them describe an alternative outcome or decision, I guess I should say too. Reflection. Have them reflect on what they thought was the most important thing they learned today. What was the easiest? What was the hardest? What made them uncomfortable? Reflection is simply nothing more than pondering or thinking about the lesson and what they learned. And finally, redirect. This is where we help the students relate their lesson learned to other skills. We kind of tie up the loose ends, I guess you might say. So we bring in a power on, power off stall to be a departure or a landing stall, times that it may occur. So that's redirect. The next thing we are going to talk about here are the two criteria that an authentic assessment has. Skills, and I'm just going to call it decision making. And we need some more room. So, two criteria for an authentic assessment. Well, everything kind of falls into either a skill-based or decision-making criteria in aviation. Under the skill base, so this is the things that you actually do, the hands-on, the takeoff, the landing, the air work, all those kind of things. Students fall into one of the following categories, and I'm going to change colors here so we can keep this straight. I'll just list them and then we'll talk about them. All right, so under the skill-based criteria, students can fall into either this is going from simple down to complex. And obviously this not observed is an option also. When they're in the describe phase, they can describe what is happening. Okay, so take a stall. They can describe what a stall is. It's pretty basic. Stall is when the wing stops producing lift, right? And that's the right answer. And that would indicate that they are able to describe the task. Next step is explain, or the explanation. Can they explain why the stall happens? Well, we increase the angle of attack from this to this, and the relative wind, you know, all this, and so if they can explain all that, then that's the level of understanding they have of that concept. Practice, they're able to do, but with supervision. They're able to get many of the pieces and parts, but not exactly to PTS standards. And perform down here, I'm just going to call this PTS. They can perform the task to PTS standards. All right, so students will move, they'll ebb and flow through here, down here, and back up to here as we add complexity to a given concept. A steep turn, for instance, they might be able to get down here to perform steep turns, and then when we throw something new at them, such as 2 steep turns in opposite directions, they might go right back here to the scribe phase. All right, and of course, not observed is an option, well, because they have not have no history with a task or a skill. They're not going to be rated on it at all. The next, the decision making. The book calls this single pilot resource management, SRM, which really boils down to, oops, that's ugly. I lose my pen every time I do that. Decision making. Single pilot resource management is the cognitive side of flying. The skill-based side is obviously hands-on, the ability to do, the ability to use your hands and feet independently. The single pilot resource management is cognitive side, and the students are placed into one of the following categories. Explain, practice, and manage or decide. And again, this is going from simple to advanced, right? So again, if they're able to, I'm not going to belabor the point here, it's similar to the skill-based. They're either able to explain it, they can practice it, or they can do it. That's all that's saying. Okay, time to move on. Another color and more real estate here. Let's talk about the oral assessment. This is what we most often use when we're working with a student. Obviously, oral assessment is just talking about what happened or how the lesson went. It answers the questions of who, what, when, where, and if we want to really get crazy and go higher level here, why and how. These are higher order thinking questions, right? So pretty simple. It's simply discussing the student's performance. This concept here promotes student participation. It reinforces their learned concepts, and it gives the instructor a gauge of how their student is progressing. If students, and this is a two-way street here, we can give them an oral assessment based on what we saw. The more effective technique is to have them give an oral assessment first and see how well we agree, see if we're on the same page or not. Hopefully you are, and you're able to progress through the program nicely. When the two differ, it's a great opportunity to sit down and say, look, this is what I'm seeing, and this is why I'm seeing or saying that. So it gives a good chance for a student and instructor to talk about their perceptions, I guess you would say. The instructor needs to ask effective questions. Effective questions in order to have a good oral assessment. The questions should be a part of the lesson plan. Asking the student questions in the lesson allows the instructor to gauge their understanding, their level of understanding. These questions serve as the framework. If you think of like a house and the framing of it, um, and they're not rigid or mandatory. You don't, if the student understands a concept, there's no point in asking the questions about it, right? The questions are to elicit a response and see how well the student understands. Uh, Obviously, our questions have to be applicable to the lesson at hand. They should be brief and concise, but clear and definite. We don't want to confuse the student. We're not trying to trick them. You have to adapt the question to the student's level of understanding, all right? You can't ask a private pilot student about chandelles or lazy eights or anything else like that because it's not in their level of understanding. It's completely out of their wheelhouse. So you have to be at their level and where they should be in their progression. That said, the questions should be challenging, though. It should cause them to think and be able to formulate some kind of answer. Questions that you want to avoid. I'm going to put no go here. Do not ask the following type of questions. Puzzles. If this, then that, then this, then that happens. Now what do you do? Okay, that's a puzzle. Nobody can keep that straight. It's like the gears, right? Now you've seen those. If this gear and 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 this gear, which way does this gear go? Who knows? Shoot, I don't know. That's ridiculousness. Another type of question to avoid. Oversized. For example, for a maintenance student, the book uses a great example. What's the first thing you do before overhauling an engine? Well, come on. What kind of question is that? You park the plane. You turn the lights on in the hangar. The question is too broad. It's too big. For a pilot, it'd be like asking, what's the first thing you do when you see weather on the on ForeFlight? Turn away from it? I mean, what do you want me to say? So avoid the oversized questions. How about the toss-up question? You can also label this the 50-50. Don't allow them just to guess, all right? You've really learned nothing. You haven't gained any insight into their understanding if you ask a toss-up question. Don't bewilder them. Bewilderment is an overly confusing question to the student, right? Uh, you see this sometimes, especially, I guess, I want to say new instructors, no matter what the discipline. They ask a question that I don't know if it is supposed to be proving this instructor's wealth of knowledge or what, but it just confuses the student and they're left wondering what the heck the instructor was talking about. Next one, trick questions. So something like this might be on a traditional assessment. We have options 1, 2, 3, and 4 for multiple choice. And a trick question would be making one letter C and then A and then D and B, right? I mean, what's the purpose of that? I guess, I don't know. Most people think that question 1 is going to be A and then B and then option C and then option D. So trick questions, yeah, they don't really help you out too much. Finally, irrelevant. Avoid irrelevant questions. Stick to the task at hand, right? asking an irrelevant question doesn't help us gain any insight or understanding to the student's thinking. And all it does is confuse them, right? Um, they wonder, how does this relate to that? I don't understand. Did I miss something here? Their self-confidence goes down, their self-esteem goes down, their self-image goes down. They're all hindrances to learning, and they walk away going, maybe I can't do this. So, good questions to avoid right there. Last section, the critique. How do we critique students? Well, let me ask you this. How do you want to be critiqued? We have all been students at one point or another. None of us were born knowing how to fly. And we definitely appreciate an instructor who is able to critique us in the most constructive manner. What does that look like? Well, there's different ways to do it. The instructor can just, and I'll write this down here. We can just have an instructor student critique. The instructor leads the discussion, offers his or her opinion, his or her observation and impressions, and the instructor drives the train, so to speak. Let me go back. These are really effective because the instructor has the expertise and they have the experience, and their words should be trusted and valued. So when an instructor gives a critique of a student, the student knows that it's an honest, frank assessment of how they're doing. A student-led critique would be just the opposite. It's the instructor asking the student to lead the critique. Very valuable when you're trying to find out what the student is thinking, what's going on in their head, what is their level of understanding. So it's a good technique for that. We can have a small group critique where the class is divided and each is assigned one part. So this is great for an NTSB case study like we talked about last lesson in Task C. Each group, takes a particular phase of flight, maybe pre-departure factors, and then an en route phase, and then however you want to break it up. And each group discusses or critiques the situation or the incident. We can also have, this is very similar, an individual student critique by another student. So, well, there's a couple different individual student critiques, I guess you would say. In the small group setting, an individual student can speak on behalf of the entire group, or you can have the entire group work together and convey their thoughts and feelings. Another type of individual student critique is having one student critique another student. So I'm thinking of a CFI class setting where a CFI student or candidate is teaching a lesson and another CFI student offers a critique on how he's doing or how she did on teaching a certain concept. So individual student critique by another student. And finally, what was that? We can do a self-critique. Simply, and there's nothing crazy about that. Having the student critique themselves. How do they think they did? and identifying weaknesses or strengths. Should add in here one more, the written critique. This one, I like the written critique because it shows a track history of a student's performance. In another setting, I've been an instructor in another setting, not aviation, but we did daily critiques on the students, on the trainees, and we were able to track from beginning to end their progress or lack of progress. And it made a great historical record for both us and the trainees to look back on and see how they're doing or how they're not doing and where they need to improve. The important thing, going back to the beginning of the lesson here, whenever you're offering an assessment of a student's abilities, regardless of if it's a skill-based or decision-based or whatever it is, think about the critiques that you have received in the past and which ones helped the most. It's probably going to be the ones that were honest and fair. We're not overly critical. We're not accusatory. And basically the instructors who tried to build you up and not the ones that just broke you down. That concludes Task D, Assessments and Critiques. I hope that helps. As always, we're using the Aviation Instructor's Handbook, FAA H8083 9 Alpha. Thanks for joining.